Next, let's take a look at composition number 6, when erase doesn't. Here we've got our mantis movie again, and we know that with a brush tool, if we select a brush from the toolbar and go over to paint options, we can paint in the channel for our alpha channel, and we can remove some of the pixels from view by using black. However, we can also use the erase tool. What's nice about the erase tool is that we can either erase the layer source and the paint only, or the last stroke. Let's see what this means when we add some paint. So I'll navigate back to the brush. I want to change Paint on Channels to RGBA. Next, I'll double-click on the layer in the composition to bring up the layer window. I need to change my brush size to something larger than 3, so I'll hold down the Control key or the Command key on a Mac to increase the brush size. Then I'm simply going to paint. Now with the eraser tool, if I choose Erase, Layer, Source, and Paint, as I use the eraser tool, note that the eraser is not only erasing the paint, but also the layer underneath that. I'll use Control-Z to undo that, then change the Erase tool to Paint Only. I use the Erase tool over my image. Now it appears that I've erased all of the paint strokes that I've applied to this movie. I'll undo this as well. Last, under the options for erase, we'll see the option for last stroke only. This is nice because I can erase not all 3 strokes, but only the last stroke I've made. As my eraser crosses over into any of the other strokes I've made, it doesn't affect the other strokes in my layer. We'll need to take a deeper look at this erase tool. By pressing F3 on the keyboard, we'll open up the effects controls for this layer. Next, let's paint on transparent. What this allows me to do is see only the paint strokes I've made on my layer. When I move over to the composition, I can see this over any of the other layers in my comp. Next, I'll change the erase tool back to paint only. I'll need to double-click on the layer to go back into the layer window, and then paint. As I paint, I'm not erasing the paint only, or so it seems. What's happening is that this option, Erase Paint Only, actually turns the paintbrush into something like a history brush. If I increase the size of my brush by holding down the Control key or the Command key on the Mac, then clicking and dragging, and paint, I can see that what I'm really doing is painting back the original layer on top of the paint strokes that I've made. If I type PP on the keyboard to reveal all of the different paint properties in the timeline, I can see that there is an eraser brush 1 and 2 here at the top of my paint strokes. By turning these off, I can see that the After Effects Paint tool isn't really erasing the paint strokes, but instead placing that original source layer back on top of all of the other brush strokes that I've made. Next, let's take a look at the composition called number 7 using vector paint. We'll need to create a new solid again, and I'll just use a simple black solid. Before the days of the paint tool in After Effects, we had an effect down in the family of painting called vector paint. Here you'll see the current paint tool as well, and if we apply that, we can apply brush strokes to the layer. But instead of using paint, we'll use vector paint. What vector paint does is give us a different tool set. Here you'll find tools similar to the new paint tool. Radius, feathering to soften out the brush, the opacity of the brush, our brush type, which contains not only paint but also an airbrush, a softer version, or a square, our color cloning, and the ability to change the radius of the stroke with the stylus or the opacity. Beneath that, we have the playback mode, which is set to current frame. Again, this is only going to play out for 1 frame. We can also use the value all strokes, which would be equivalent to continuous. We have pass strokes, which would animate the stroke up to that point, or hold strokes, which would hold all the strokes throughout the animation, animate strokes, which would produce a write-on, or turn on onion skinning, which will allow us to see a range of frames around our current frame, much the way Photoshop does. We also have wiggle control, which we'll get to in a minute. We'll change our playback mode to all strokes. Inside our composition window, you'll see at the very top there's a small arrow. The flyout menu gives us the ability to select the paths that we create for vector paint change between the different tools for the vector paint, change the ability for our stylus to control the radius, the opacity, or a color cloning, and also some shift paint options and options for the way that we look at the vector paint preferences. We'll click OK for this, then take a look at our cursor inside our composition. It's a small circle indicating the radius of our brush with a dot in the very center indicating where our path will be. Again, I'll create a very simple octopus illustration. And once that's created, I can see the path that defines this by clicking on the selection tool in the upper left-hand corner of the comp window. Remember, this is an effect, so I'm not creating it on the layer, I'm creating the effect inside the composition. If I click and drag over the location of my path for vector paint, I can see it represented as a small gray line inside of my paint stroke. The real benefit of vector paint is the ability to wiggle the stroke. Here, underneath Wiggle Controls, I can enable the wiggling, and by enabling this, I gain control over all of the parameters that animate the way After Effects will draw the stroke. Wiggles per second is going to show me how fast this will wiggle. Displacement of the stroke can be modified here, and the amount here, as well as the pressure variation, which will change the thickness in areas, and the pressure detail, which will describe how subdivided this path will be. At the bottom, I can composite this paint on the original layer by showing only the paint strokes and turning on my transparency grid. I can see that I have full opacity only where the vector strokes occur. If I'm happy with this, I can continue to add more brush strokes to this effect. All of the other brush strokes that I add are contained in this one effect and are governed by all of the different parameters inside the wiggle control. However, I can change some of these. Using the direct selection tool, I'll drag an area to select only that one path, then click on the color chip to bring up my color picker. Now I can choose from any of the colors and click OK. Here you can see, even inside this one effect, the colors applied only to that one selection that I've made. A quick RAM preview shows what the animation made with vector paint might look like. Although the wiggle control is really the only thing that's missing in the new paint features, you can get much more with the new paint than you can by using the traditional vector paint.